At 11:25 in the morning local time, the seafloor off Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula ruptured along a stretch of fault that had been quietly building strain since 1952. Within minutes, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center issued its first threat message. Within hours, Hawaii's governor was standing in front of cameras warning residents that the coming wave would not simply hit one beach, it would wrap around the entire island chain. And by the time the waves finally stopped arriving, they had reached the coastlines of Russia, Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, China, Vietnam, Malaysia, New Zealand, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, the Cook Islands, French Polynesia, Hawaii, Alaska, California, Oregon, Washington, Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, and Chile. A single earthquake, generating a single tsunami, had reached out and touched nearly every coastline bordering the largest ocean on the planet, sweeping across a distance so vast it's genuinely difficult to hold in your head all at once. This is the story of the magnitude 8. 8. Kamchatka earthquake, one of the 10 most powerful earthquakes ever recorded, and the ocean-spanning tsunami it unleashed. Stay with me on this one, because the actual scale of what happened here is genuinely difficult to comprehend until you trace it step by step, coastline by coastline. Drop a comment and tell me if you personally received a tsunami warning during this event, wherever in the Pacific you happen to be, because I want to know just how far this real-time alert actually reached in practice. And if you want more deep dives into major seismic events like this one, subscribe now, because understanding how these systems actually respond in real time is genuinely one of the most important things you can know if you live anywhere near a coastline. Let's start with the earthquake itself, because understanding its true scale is essential to understanding everything that followed. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, the earthquake struck at 23:24 UTC on July 29, 2025, along the Kuril-Kamchatka Trench at a depth of 7 kilometers, roughly 119 kilometers east-southeast of the Russian city of Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, a city of roughly 180,000 people. The Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO, the international body coordinating tsunami warning systems, confirmed the earthquake as the most powerful seismic event recorded globally since the 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, and one of the 10 strongest earthquakes recorded since 1900. Researchers at UCLA's Earth, Planetary, and Space Sciences Department went further, describing the event as comparable in scale to that same 2011 Tohoku earthquake, a magnitude 9, one event that remains one of the most devastating natural disasters of the 21st century. It's worth understanding exactly what a seismic gap actually means to a geologist, because the concept is genuinely central to how scientists think about long-term earthquake risk along any major fault system. A seismic gap describes a segment of a fault, or trench, that hasn't experienced a major rupture in a long time, relative to the surrounding segments, even though tectonic plates on either side of it continue grinding past each other at a measurable, unrelenting pace. That continued motion doesn't simply stop just because a particular segment hasn't ruptured recently. It keeps loading stress into that locked section of the fault, year after year, decade after decade, until the accumulated strain eventually exceeds what the rock can withstand. Scientists studying seismic gaps around the world have used this exact framework to identify numerous fault segments carrying genuine, elevated long-term risk, including sections of California's San Andreas Fault and Japan's own subduction zones, precisely because the underlying physics, stress steadily accumulating until it's finally released, applies consistently across virtually every major fault system on the planet. Here's why this specific location carries such enormous geological significance, and why the earthquake, despite its almost incomprehensible power, genuinely fits into a pattern scientists had been watching unfold for decades. The Kuril-Kamchatka Trench marks the boundary where the Pacific Plate dives beneath the North American Plate, moving westward at roughly 80 millimeters per year, one of the fastest moving and most seismically active plate boundaries anywhere on Earth. In 1952, a magnitude 9. Zero earthquake struck less than 30 kilometers from where this 2025 rupture occurred, tearing open a 600-kilometer stretch of the trench and generating its own destructive tsunami. In 1923, a separate magnitude 8. 4 earthquake ruptured a segment of the trench just to the north. Researchers at UCLA specifically noted that the 2025 earthquake appears to have filled a seismic gap sitting directly between those two historic ruptures, releasing strain that had been quietly accumulating for decades. Since that 1952 earthquake, the Pacific Plate had moved roughly 6 meters relative to the Kamchatka Peninsula, storing an enormous reservoir of tectonic energy that was finally unleashed in a single catastrophic instant on July 29, 2025. If you found that explanation of seismic gaps genuinely useful, a like on this video helps more people understand exactly how scientists actually think about long-term earthquake risk, rather than treating major earthquakes as purely random, unpredictable events with no underlying scientific logic behind them at all. Now let's talk about why this earthquake genuinely earns the title nobody saw coming, even though, in hindsight, the broader seismic gap it filled had been recognized by scientists for years. Just over a week before the main event, a sequence of 5 powerful earthquakes struck the same broader Kamchatka region, the largest reaching magnitude 7.4. Those earlier quakes were significant in their own right, genuinely major seismic events by any normal standard, but they gave no definitive indication that an earthquake more than 10 times more powerful was still building beneath the surface, ready to strike within days. That's precisely the challenge that makes large earthquake predictions so fundamentally difficult, even with decades of accumulated seismic monitoring data. Scientists can identify a seismic gap, a stretch of fault carrying dangerous accumulated stress based on its rupture history, and they can say with real confidence that a major earthquake there is a matter of when rather than if. But translating that broad, long-term geological understanding into a specific date or even a specific week remains genuinely beyond current scientific capability, which is exactly why a rupture this massive, arriving directly on the heels of a smaller earthquake sequence that had already rattled the region, still caught the world by surprise. Let's talk about exactly how fast the response actually unfolded once the earthquake did strike, because the speed of that response represents one of the more remarkable achievements buried within this entire disaster story. And if you've made it this far into the video, subscribe now, because the international coordination that happened next genuinely deserves to be understood in detail. According to the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center issued its initial tsunami threat message for coastal regions in Russia and Japan just 10 minutes after the earthquake occurred. Within minutes of that first alert, tsunami warning systems activated across the entire Pacific Basin simultaneously, part of a coordinated international monitoring network that has been built and refined through decades of cooperation under the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, which has coordinated global tsunami warning efforts since 1965. Millions of people across dozens of countries were alerted within minutes of the rupture, giving coastal communities genuine, actionable lead time to move away from vulnerable shorelines before the first waves ever arrived. It's worth understanding exactly how a tsunami warning system like this one manages to issue a meaningful alert within just 10 minutes of an earthquake occurring, because the underlying technology genuinely represents decades of careful, coordinated scientific development. Seismic monitoring stations positioned around the Pacific Basin continuously detect ground motion in real time, and when a large earthquake occurs, computer systems can calculate its location, depth, and estimated magnitude within just a few minutes, based on the pattern of seismic waves detected across multiple stations simultaneously. Combine that rapid seismic assessment with pre-built computer models, simulating how a tsunami would propagate outward from earthquakes of various magnitudes at various locations, models built and refined, using data from decades of previous tsunami events, and warning centers can generate a genuinely actionable, if still preliminary, threat assessment within minutes, long before any actual wave has traveled far enough to be directly measured by ocean-based sensors. That initial estimate then gets continuously refined and updated as additional data arrives, including direct measurements from deep ocean buoys specifically designed to detect a tsunami wave's actual height and speed as it crosses the open ocean. The regional impact near the epicenter itself was immediate and severe. Ports on the Kamchatka Peninsula flooded as residents fled inland. In Severokurilsk, a coastal town in Russia's Kuril Islands, the local mayor reported that tsunami waves flooded the fishing port directly, washing fish and debris through the streets. TASS, Russia's state news agency, reported power outages and mobile phone service failures across the regional capital, while officials began evacuating residents from Sakhalin Island as emergency services worked at full capacity managing the immediate regional crisis. Multiple aftershocks followed the main rupture, including at least one reaching magnitude 6.9, a genuinely significant earthquake in its own right, occurring in the immediate aftermath of an already catastrophic main event. Now, let's trace exactly how far this tsunami actually traveled, because the scale genuinely becomes difficult to comprehend once you follow it across the full breadth of the Pacific Basin. And if you found the warning system explanation genuinely fascinating, subscribe now, because tracking exactly how this wave crossed the entire ocean is genuinely one of the more remarkable parts of this whole story. The waves reached Japan first, where tide gauges recorded heights up to 32 meters, and workers were evacuated from the Fukushima nuclear plant as a precautionary measure while officials assessed the incoming threat. From there, the tsunami continued its journey eastward across the open Pacific, and roughly 6 hours after the earthquake struck, the initial waves reached the U.S. West Coast, triggering warnings and advisories across California, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. Hawaii recorded wave heights up to 174 meters in Kahului on the island of Maui, with the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center estimating the first wave's arrival in Hawaii at 7:17 p.m. local time. Hawaii's Governor Josh Green described data from Midway Atoll, positioned between Japan and Hawaii, showing tsunami waves measuring 6 feet from peak to trough, and cautioned that a wave of that scale could genuinely move cars and dislodge trees, urging residents to stay away from the coastline entirely rather than risk underestimating the danger. The tsunami's reach didn't stop at Hawaii or the U.S. mainland. Ecuador issued a tsunami advisory specifically for the Galapagos Islands, suspending maritime activities and evacuating coastal zones as a precaution. Peru and Colombia both activated their own precautionary alerts and safety measures. French Polynesia revised its forecast to warn of potential wave heights reaching up to 4 meters in certain areas, though the waves that ultimately arrived stayed under 1 meter. Fiji, Tonga, the Cook Islands, and Samoa all issued tsunami watches that were later downgraded as the immediate threat passed. On the western side of the Pacific, tsunami alerts were issued across China, the Philippines, Indonesia, New Zealand, Vietnam, and Malaysia. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center's own official threat assessment specifically warned of possible waves between 1 and 3 meters along coastal areas of Hawaii, Chile, Japan, and the Solomon Islands, with waves potentially exceeding 3 meters, specifically along parts of Russia and Ecuador. Stop and actually absorb the sheer geographic scope of what just got described, because it's genuinely one of the most remarkable civil defense responses in recent memory. A single earthquake, striking a specific, relatively remote stretch of Russian coastline, generated tsunami warnings, advisories, or watches issued by national governments spanning the entire rim of the Pacific Ocean, from Russia and Japan in the northwest, down through Southeast Asia, across to New Zealand and the Pacific Island nations in the southwest, over to Chile, Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia along the South American coast, and up through Hawaii and the entire U.S. west coast. As Hawaii's Governor Green put it directly, describing the wave's expected behavior around the islands specifically, it will not hit one beach, it will wrap around the islands. That same basic description, in a considerably larger sense, applied to the entire Pacific Basin itself. This tsunami didn't hit one coastline, it wrapped around the ocean. Given a threat of this scale, it's genuinely remarkable and worth understanding clearly that the ultimate human toll from the tsunami itself remained comparatively limited. And if you've made it this far into the video, subscribe now, because understanding exactly why the outcome turned out this way, rather than far worse, is genuinely one of the most important parts of this entire story. CNN's coverage specifically noted that despite the extraordinary strength of the earthquake, tied for the 6th strongest ever recorded, little significant tsunami damage was ultimately reported across most of the Pacific Basin, even as nations from Japan to the United States to Chile remained on high alert with millions of people urged to evacuate. In Hawaii specifically, there were reports of flooding on the Big Island, but no reports of widespread, significant damage, prompting Governor Green to tell reporters directly that the lack of a wave of major consequence came as a great relief. That outcome, a globally significant, historically powerful earthquake, producing a tsunami that reached nearly every corner of the Pacific without inflicting the kind of catastrophic, mass casualty damage historical events of similar magnitude have sometimes produced, reflects genuine credit to the decades of investment in the international tsunami warning infrastructure that sprang into action within minutes of the initial rupture. That doesn't mean the broader earthquake itself was without serious consequence. The Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission's own coverage was careful to distinguish between the tsunami's relatively limited direct impact and the earthquake's own separate, more severe toll, noting that while the tsunami itself remained comparatively limited in its damage, the earthquake caused significant loss of life primarily from collapsed buildings and landslides triggered directly by the ground shaking itself, entirely separate from the wave that followed. That distinction matters enormously for understanding this event accurately. The tsunami warning system performed remarkably well, giving coastal communities genuine time to evacuate before the wave's arrival. But the earthquake's own violent shaking, striking a populated regional capital and surrounding communities directly, caused real, serious harm independent of anything the ocean itself eventually did. There's a genuinely fascinating scientific postscript to this story worth understanding, because researchers didn't just track this tsunami through traditional coastal tide gauges and warning center calculations, and if you found the human toll distinction between the earthquake and the tsunami genuinely clarifying, a like on this video helps more people understand exactly why those two separate hazards deserve to be evaluated independently rather than lumped together as a single, undifferentiated disaster statistic. According to researchers at the University of Washington and Oregon State University, the National Science Foundation's Ocean Observatories Initiative operates something called the Regional Cabled Array, a seafloor observatory positioned offshore of Oregon and Washington State, featuring more than 150 individual instruments transmitting real-time data back to shore at the speed of light through undersea cables. That sophisticated monitoring network captured the Kamchatka earthquake's seismic energy and the resulting tsunami's journey across the Pacific in remarkable scientific detail, giving researchers an unprecedented moment-by-moment data set documenting exactly how a tsunami of this scale actually propagates across thousands of miles of open ocean before finally reaching a distant coastline. That kind of detailed, real-time seafloor data, essentially impossible to collect for a tsunami event of this scale even a couple of decades ago, represents a genuine leap forward in scientists' ability to study and eventually improve forecasting for these enormous ocean-spanning events. Let's talk about why an event like this matters for anyone living anywhere along the Pacific Rim, regardless of how far your specific home happens to sit from Kamchatka itself. And if you've made it this far into this video, subscribe now, because there's genuinely more worth understanding about how this event has already shaped ongoing tsunami preparedness policy. This earthquake represents a genuinely rare, real-world demonstration of the full scale of the tsunami threat facing communities scattered across an entire ocean basin, and the international coordination that actually responded to it in real time. If you live in Hawaii, coastal Alaska, the west coast of the continental United States, coastal regions of Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, New Zealand, or any of the Pacific Island nations mentioned throughout this event, this earthquake is a genuine, recent, real-world case study in exactly how quickly and how far a tsunami threat can travel from a rupture point that might be thousands of miles from your own coastline. Understanding your own community's specific tsunami evacuation routes, whether you live near a beach that would be affected by a distant source tsunami like this one, arriving hours after the triggering earthquake, versus a near-field tsunami capable of arriving within minutes of a much closer, more locally felt earthquake, genuinely matters, because the appropriate response differs meaningfully between those two scenarios. There's also a broader piece of ongoing legislative and scientific context worth understanding here, because events like the Kamchatka earthquake have directly shaped how governments continue investing in tsunami preparedness infrastructure. In the United States, specifically, the Tsunami Warning, Research and Education Act of 2026 passed through the Senate Commerce Committee earlier this year, reauthorizing appropriations for NOAA's tsunami programs at increased funding levels through 2030, with lawmakers specifically citing the ongoing serious tsunami risk facing states like Washington, home to its own long-overdue Cascadia subduction zone threat, as justification for continued sustained investment in exactly the kind of rapid detection and warning infrastructure that performed so effectively during the Kamchatka event. That legislative response reflects a broader ongoing recognition among scientists and policymakers alike that events of this scale, however rare, remain a genuine, persistent risk requiring continuous investment rather than a one-time infrastructure build that can simply be considered finished and complete. Here's the thought I want to leave you with. And it's worth remembering the next time you hear about a major earthquake striking somewhere that feels distant, disconnected from your own coastline. Most people, understandably, think of earthquakes and tsunamis as fundamentally local disasters, a specific city or coastline experiencing a specific, contained catastrophe. What the Kamchatka earthquake demonstrated, in genuinely striking, real-time fashion, is that the largest earthquakes on the planet don't respect that kind of geographic containment at all. A single rupture along a remote stretch of Russian coastline sent measurable warning-worthy waves to nations spanning literally every direction around the Pacific Rim, from the Arctic reaches of Alaska down to the southern tip of South America, from the eastern shores of Asia across to islands scattered throughout the South Pacific, and onward to the western coastline of an entire continent. That the resulting damage remained as limited as it did stands as a genuine testament to decades of international scientific cooperation and infrastructure investment. Built specifically to buy vulnerable coastal communities, precious hours of warning before an invisible, silent wave, born from a rupture most of the affected world never even felt, arrives quietly on their own shore.